I'd ask you to turn in your Bibles to Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, and chapter 6. We're going to take a break today from our normal series, and just because it's Mother's Day, and because I really felt a burden to bring some encouragement and some ministry to mothers, specifically for them, specifically thinking about the mums in this church, but also to all of us here, because this business of motherhood affects us all. We can't get away from it, whether we like it or not. If we're part of a church, we bear some part to play in the lives of mothers, and all of us have our relationships with people who are mothers, and there's a lot for us to be concerned about here. So if you can turn to Proverbs chapter 6, and my text for the sermon today is in verse 20 to 22. I'll read from verse 20 down to verse 24. Let me read to you Proverbs chapter 6 and beginning at verse 20, where Solomon writes, "My son, keep your father's commandment and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always, tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk with you. For the commandment is a lamp, and its teaching a light. And the reproofs of discipline are the way of life, to preserve you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. Do not desire her beauty in your heart. Do not let her capture you with her eyelashes." We'll leave the reading there. Today I want to talk with you all about mothers teaching their children. Let's talk about mothers teaching children. And, well, in these verses, Solomon is telling his son, amongst other things, not to forsake, not to leave aside or let go of his mother's teaching, Solomon's wife's teaching to his son. And he's also talking about his own commandments. "My son, keep your father's commandment, and forsake not your mother's teaching." In verse 21, he's trying to persuade his son to keep that's these teachings, the commandment of his father and the teaching of his mother, keep them close. In other words, keep them right by you. Doesn't want his son to forget what his mother has taught him. He doesn't want him to neglect it. In verse 22, you can see he's encouraging his son. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk with you. He's encouraging him that the guidance from the teaching of his mother, as well as his own, will be always with him. It's a tremendous benefit. And I would say, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, that the tragedy today in the 21st century is that there are so many children who have so little in the way of instruction from their mothers to carry with them through their lives. This is the lost generation, isn't it? Of children growing up without the blessing of mothers teaching. And they don't know what to do. And they're desperate for guidance. They're desperate for help. They're desperately clutching at something, anything to tell them which direction to go in, what's right, what's wrong. They don't know. Now, these verses are speaking about both father's commandment and mother's teaching, but it's Mother's Day, and I want us just to stop today, and it's really a very, very simple message that I have for you, drawing out the obvious implication from these verses, and the obvious implication for us all today is that if children are going to benefit from their mother's teaching, then mothers need to be teaching their children, right? So you now know where I'm going. And okay, it could be a little painful, but I hope you'll agree with me it's very necessary, and I hope it's going to be a real encouragement and a help to mothers and to us as a church as we look at the need to support mothers in their calling here. And we're not saying that it's only their job. Solomon wasn't saying that, and I'm not saying that, but for the sake of Mother's Day, we're focusing on mothers. Are you with me? Is that okay for today? Teaching in these verses is obviously talking about religious and moral instruction. The word in the Hebrew is the word Torah. It's translated in some older translations, the Authorized Version, the New King James Version, translate it as law. Most people know what their mother's law is, don't they? I saw a sign that said, in this kitchen there are 2 rules that apply. Number 1, I'm the boss. Number 2, see number 1. And I don't know what your mother's rules were in your home, but you can probably, if you try, still remember them. The sign above the toilet, if you sprinkle when you tinkle, be sweet and wipe the seat. The rules that mums make, if you wear it, you wash it. If you use it, you put it away. If you cook it, you share it. And those are the kind of rules mothers make. But mothers make a lot more rules than that, don't they? Your mother's Torah would include more than her version of the Ten Commandments. And in fact, the word Torah in the Old Testament, which is translated here as teaching, could refer to the law of God, but generally speaking, it would always be referring to some kind of divine standard for us, God's standard of conduct for his people. And it doesn't just mean a legal code either. In the Old Testament, it came actually to refer, the word Torah was used and is used to refer to the whole of the 5 first books in the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The Pentateuch were called the Torah. And as you know, if you've read any of those books, there's an awful lot of history, narrative in those books. And that too would be included in the word Torah. It would be the teaching that was there for us from God. Now, in that sense, it could just mean teaching in an ordinary sense, the thing that was taught. And again in the book of Proverbs, Solomon uses it in this sense of instruction in wisdom and teaching in wise living, how to live skillfully in a way that pleases God, in the fear of God, which Solomon in Proverbs warns his son many times not to forsake his own teaching. And it's not something which is peculiar to mums. The fathers are assumed to be teaching as well. But in Proverbs 31, which you might, if you were feeling that I was going to be incredibly cruel to the mums today, you might have thought I was going to preach on. And Proverbs 31 woman is described as someone who opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching, the Torah of kindness, is on her tongue. And so Torah, the word Torah, has this sense which is often paralleled with wisdom or the commandment, parental commandment. So, okay, look, what does it mean here? Solomon is saying to his son, do not forsake your father's commandment and your mother's, do not forsake your mother's teaching, your mother's Torah. What did it mean? Well, it could be that he's talking about the teaching children godly wisdom to enable them to live skillfully. It could be instruction in moral issues, telling them what's right and wrong. It could be teaching them the Bible, the Torah, and you'd say that children need to hear the message of the Bible, and the stories of the Bible need to be taught to children. It could be all of that. And I think one point is obvious, an application, an implication from all of this is very clear. Mothers were expected to be teaching their children. And they were expected to be teaching them the things of God. Religious, moral instruction. For some people, that's a bad word. The word religious is a bad word, and that's because they contrast it with salvation by grace. Well, I'm not making that contrast. True religion, said James, is this, and he described it. And I'm just using the word religion in a general sense and saying that to do with the things of God, this religious instruction, this religious teaching about God in a right sense is something that was expected that mothers would do for their children. And it's not talking about maths, for instance. Great to teach your children maths if you can. Maybe that's not the best thing for them or the best thing for you. And by the way, I don't believe that the Bible requires Christian parents to be teaching their children maths, for instance, rather than somebody else teaching your children maths. Sometimes well-meaning Christians use and abuse, actually, Deuteronomy 6 and verse 7 to try to say that Christians should and must, according to the Bible, be the ones that teach their children everything. Well, you can't find that in the Bible, but it is obviously taught as normal in the Bible that Christian parents are going to be teaching their children about the things of God, godly wisdom and morals. And obviously, for Christians, that also means the gospel. The gospel is the central message of the whole Bible. The message of redemption is the theme that runs through the whole of Scripture. And so we can't, as Christians, teach it without teaching our children the gospel. And I don't know what you think, but I would say look around you in the world today, and you have to say that in 2016, this is not happening on a grand scale. I mean, is this happening in Christian homes even? And I hope some people in this room would answer yes. It's happening in your home, but I think you have to agree with me as you look around. We are facing a disaster. as a generation is growing up, or has grown up rather, that doesn't teach its children. Some of you grew up in homes with fearsome mothers, and they taught you the difference between right and wrong. And maybe as you've learned more of the Bible, you wish that they could have been more biblical in what they taught you. But they taught you right and wrong, and you were shaped by that instruction. They were not going to let you get out of the kitchen before they'd cornered you and spoken to you and corrected you, and you knew, and it changed you. But there's a generation growing up that doesn't get that. Let's give a shout out to all our mums who bothered with us. In my case, I can't remember anything from the first 4 years of my life. And yet I know historically that my mum stayed at home and taught me. Because I remember when she went back to work as a teacher, and I guess she must have taught me to read. I can't remember learning to read. She must have taught me all sorts of things. I can't remember learning those things, but she shaped me with her instruction, and I'm going to say we need to honor that. We need to be grateful for that. What's happening to this generation? Are you frightened that mothers today are not teaching their children? I believe you should be. I think this is terrifying, and I think more than ever there's a desperate need for mothers to teach their children. But the trend is quite opposite. The trend is actually for mothers, as soon as it's physically possible for them to do so, to hand over the teaching of their children to somebody else as quick as possible. All right, I'm going to say something about nurseries, and some of you are probably going to be offended by this, but hear me out. A 2012 government survey of nursery use gave us these statistics. About 90% of parents of 3- and 4-year-old children received the government funding for government-provided childcare. If you've got a 3-year-old, it's about 79%. For 4-year-olds, 98% of parents received that education for their children provided for by the government. In 2012, 64% of mothers were in work of some kind, and actually 29% of mothers were in full-time occupations. 54% of the mothers who were not working said in response to the survey that they wished they were working and they would want to be working instead of bringing up their children at home, if only they could find the right kind of childcare that was convenient and affordable and reliable. Now you say, what's the problem with nursery? Does that stop parents teaching their children? Not necessarily. But nursery is not full-time. Surely mums can educate them in these things that matter outside of nursery time. Maybe you're managing to do that. I'm not going to say that's impossible, but if you know anything about raising children, you know that actually teachable moments in the life of your child come here and there. And they need instruction, but they're not always ready and able to receive it, and yet there are these moments. Very well, you can schedule in every day a family Bible time. It's a wonderful thing to do. You can sit your children down and have positive instruction in the things of God at a scheduled time, and you can make sure it happens, and that's wonderful and great. But, actually, the teaching moments, the moments where the lessons really sink in and things come crystal clear, are often actually around moments of correction and moments of interaction with your children at times of discipline or times of tears and frustration. And so what about those moments? It's very hard to find other people to do that for you. It's very, very hard. So why am I speaking so much about nursery education? Well, as if it was somehow a problem. Well, I believe it's because the opportunities that exist, the opportunities that come for teaching children are precious, precious opportunities. And we should think long and hard before we give them up and hand them over to others to do that for us. I wonder if you've ever thought that the two of the most powerful words in the English language are yes and no. Those two words actually wield power in the lives of others. And the person that wields those words exercises an incredible amount of influence over the person to whom they're spoken. Like it or not, the person who's wielding the yes or the no is actually laying down the law for your children. You're teaching them, when you say that, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. You're teaching them right, and you're teaching them wrong. You're giving them moral instruction, whether you call it that or not. And so every time we correct our children, we're teaching them, right? By the way, if you say no and then you don't enforce it with some kind of loving, restrained, godly discipline, if you don't enforce no with discipline, then you are teaching them something about the law. You're teaching them something. And if you say no all the time and you never use the word yes, you're also teaching them something about law, aren't you? It's a different lesson. We ought to be careful about how we use the words yes and no. And if we say yes all the time and never use the word no, it says something about law. And one of the most important lessons I believe a child can learn is what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And he goes on to justify it from the Torah in the Old Testament. And he lays down the law in the New Testament for children. Believe it or not, there's law in the New Testament. And one of the laws is that children have to obey their parents. As you lovingly, patiently, kindly, but firmly enforce that law in your home, you're teaching, and they're learning. They're learning that that is something they must do. But you know, children, as they grow, mums, do I need to ask you to tell me this is right? As children grow, they test that law, and then they test it again, don't they? I don't know if it goes along with a growth spurt, but there's somehow in our experience there from time to time seems to be a kind of rebelliousness spurt. I don't know what causes it, but the boundaries that were established before, the rules that were established before and tested and found steady, and you think we can forget that and move on and learn different lessons, and then a little while later it's tested again, And the child is growing, but the child is learning again and again and again. And, every time you reinforce those rules, you're training them, aren't you? You're actually training that child. But to reinforce those rules that you've established, you have to be kind of around, don't you? You have to have some interaction with your child. There has to be a presence in their life where you're seeing, where you're observing, where you're correcting, where you're interacting, where you're teaching. And it's not all about saying no and discipline, and it's about what you positively instruct them in. Those things need repeating, don't they? Because children forget. And mums, does it feel like the instruction never ends? Does it feel like one unceasing effort to repeat and repeat and repeat the lessons, and the children just have to be told again and again and again? Is that wearing? Is it frustrating? Is it tiring? Think about it, though. All that unceasing instruction, all that input into what is right and wrong. If this is a godly mother we're talking about, okay, if this is somebody who loves God, who's feeding on his word, who's praying to God, oh, change my heart, Lord, conform my heart to your heart, oh God. I want to love what you love. I want to hate what you hate. I want to see what is right as what you declare is right. And someone who is internalizing it. She loves righteousness. She hates evil. She loves justice. She hates injustice. She loves peace and gentleness. She hates harshness, unkind, angry words. She hates sin. She loves love and patience and kindness, but she hates selfishness, and pride is something that is ugly to her. A proud look she knows God hates, and she sees that and she hates it. It grieves her. She hates prejudice. In fact, everything in her is shaped by what you would say God's view of morality is. And she's walking in the light. And you know what? All that inner transformation in the heart of the mother comes out on her face. The moment she sees a sin in the life of her child, her face shows a look of horror, of disappointment, of dislike. It's going to show up in sheer delight and wonder and admiration for something which is good and right. Righteousness is going to be something that just thrills that woman. Kindness, gentleness in a child lights her up. And yet there's going to be sorrow and dismay at everything her child does, which is evil. And by the way, do I have to remind you that actually children do things that are evil? No, I don't have to remind you that. Some of you have got them, and others of you teach them. Back in the 70s when I was a child, sociologists had changed the idea about how to raise children, and they reframed everything from a philosophical standpoint that said, no, children are basically good inside. The Bible says that we're born sinners, and that unrestrained, our sin grows, it develops, it's restrained, and children left to themselves will be not only cruel, but they'll end up doing things that are downright evil. They will not restrain themselves. They will not govern themselves. They will not educate themselves. They're not just these little innocent flowers just waiting to blossom and to open up their petals for everyone to see. No, there's a rottenness inside the human nature which, when it's left, it shows. And it's going to show. But you know, when that child is around a godly woman, and every time that sin shows up, that child sees the look of disappointment, of pain, and hears the no, and learns the lesson, perhaps the painful lesson, that is not an avenue that brings blessing, but that's an avenue of activity that brings punishment, that brings pain. Every time a child learns that lesson, they're learning. They're learning. It's going to radically affect, if you're a godly woman, it's going to radically affect the way you use those two words, isn't it? Yes and no. It's going to change it. And how many times a day do you say that? Mums, I've got no idea. Tell me, how many times a day do you say the words yes and no? Go on, have a guess. Someone shout it out. 50, 100, 200? What do you think? Any advances on 200? 250, okay. How many lessons? And yet, each one is a lesson in it's such a powerful lesson, isn't it? In right and wrong. Someone objects, well, actually, all this wrong is going to do my child psychological harm. If you keep telling them something's wrong and it's bad and it's evil, if you're saying that a child's behavior can be evil, that would be psychologically damaging to them. Well, hold on a moment. As a Christian mother, every time you say the word no, yes, you're trying to lay down the law. But you're also laying down the law when you say yes, when you say good, when you say that's it, when you say that's right, when you say wonderful. And it doesn't have to be all no and negative. And as I mentioned before, if it is, it's kind of teaching them something about the law, isn't it? Without encouragement and without love and without positive instruction in righteousness, children are missing something profound, aren't they? But oh boy, when you do lay down the law for your children, they're learning a lesson about themselves, aren't they? Because even though you lay down the law, and even though they agree with the law that it's right, and even though they agree that what they did last time was wrong and bad, they do it again. And then they do it again. And then they do it again. Actually, if all you ever do is lay down the law, you're just heaping up a weight of guilt on your children's shoulders that they cannot bear. Because they're sinners just like you. And they need the gospel. But someone has to teach them the gospel. Someone has to instruct them. And what more precious moments of instruction than the very moment when they've sinned again and they're looking at themselves and they're saying, I've done it again. I remember my friend's child who looked into his daddy's eyes and said, Daddy, I promise from now on I will be good. There's the rich young man. Okay, go on then. Go on then. Go and fulfill the law. You know what's right. You go and do it. Actually, remember, this is how high the law is. Oh, but next time that child faces his own sin again, is there a moment there where you can teach the gospel like no other? Where you can explain the reality that we're sinners and we need the forgiveness of this holy God who we offend? Well, he's got to know about God, so you've got to be teaching him about God, and he's got to understand about Jesus and how Jesus went to that cross to pay the penalty, to pay the price for sins. So he's got to understand about punishment. He's got to understand about sin. He's got to understand about justice. But as he does, and he hears from you again the news, the good news, the wonderful news that God came down from heaven to save sinners, that God doesn't want to just crush sinners, although he must and he will punish them. But that's not God's desire. His desire is to save sinners. And he sent his own son to suffer in the place of sinners, so that this sinner could go free. Oh, you get the chance to explain the gospel like nobody else. And you get the chance to do that again and again and again. And I want to encourage you, mums, today. I don't know how best to encourage you, but I want to encourage you that is worth it. That is worth any amount of sacrifice. I mean, this is hard. This takes repeated frustration and self-sacrifice on your part. But those teaching moments in the life of your child are precious beyond your imagination and mine. If you don't teach them, who will? Can you find a nursery to do that? I mean, God bless those nursery workers. Don't you feel just gutted for the poor children who otherwise, if they were at home, they'd just be abandoned by their parents, and then some lovely nursery worker who perhaps cares for children themselves, that's why they're doing it, you hope, is willing to put themselves out of their way to look after those poor kids? But can you find a nursery where they're going to teach your children like that? And I'm not trying to say that all nursery is bad, and there's nothing in the Bible that says thou shalt not send thy child to nursery. But can you find someone who's prepared to instruct your children? You're not going to get that kind of instruction from a screen either. It's really hard. And perhaps the screen is more of a problem in children's lives in 2016 than nursery. How many parents drop their children off at the nursery of a screen in their own home and leave them there to be cared for by the nursery workers of a screen? Leave them to interact with that nursery worker that can't hear them, that can't see them, that doesn't know about God, that cannot correct them, that cannot say to them yes or no. An article by Jane Wakefield for the BBC on the 27th of March in 2015, a year ago now, was all about the rise of the use of screens in the lives of children. And she highlighted a report that was written which charted the rise in the number of hours that children interact with screens over the last 20 years. Some of you are in your early 20s, but in 1995, when that study began, it was repeated every year, and they compared the results. You know, in 1995, children between age 5 and 16 spent an average of around 3 hours in front of a television every day. That was you. In 2015, it was 6.5 hours a day, average. Teenage boys watched the most, surprisingly, and I think I know what some of them were watching, but they averaged 8 hours a day. 8 hours a day. 8-year-old girls averaged the least in 2015, but that was 3.5 hours a day for an 8-year-old girl, average. Now, screen time in this survey equaled TV, playing games, consoles, using a mobile computer or tablet. And there are all sorts of screens, but the point is they were watching a screen and not being taught by their parents. I'm not saying, and I wouldn't say, ban the screen, which is one approach. And I wouldn't condemn you if you made that choice in your home. But I don't say that. I do need to point out, however, that there's a problem, isn't there? In our generation, times are changing. The Connected Kids report, compiled by market researcher Childwise, which this article was based on, collected this data from 1995 to the present, and it showed that teenage girls now average 7.5 hours a day compared with 3.5 hours in 1995. 5 to 10-year-olds, in 1995, it was 2.5 hours of TV. But in 2014, it was 4.5 hours a day for 5 to 10-year-olds. I mean, but hang on a minute. 5 to 10-year-olds are at school for a good part of the day. I mean, by the time you've taken them to school and brought them, and they've been at school and you've brought them back from school, how much time in the day is left? And yet they're averaging 4.5 hours of interaction with a screen. A screen. And teenagers, it's 7.5 hours for teenage girls and 8 hours for teenage boys, but they're at school longer. When are parents ever talking with their children? And you can't teach children without talking to them, can you? I hope you understand why I'm kind of a little bit worked up about it, because this is our generation. These are the children that are in our homes and our friends' homes. This is the generation that we've grown up in. Why do almost all parents, to one degree or another, give up their children, give up precious minutes of interacting with their children, and allow them to spend literally hours a day interacting with a screen? Why do parents do that? I think you know. Why do 98% of parents of 4-year-olds hand over their 4-year-old to a nursery for hours and hours a week? Why? Well, I understand that there's a need to work to survive. You can't always give children the care that you would long to give them, and some people live in very difficult circumstances, and I'm not here to pick up a stone and throw it at them and to say, no nursery, never. I do want to say to mothers and to everyone, children need their mother's teaching, don't they? Children need it. And teaching takes time and it takes effort. It is frustratingly hard. But look, if we are going to buck the trend of our generation, if the children represented in this room, both now and in the future, are going to be different, we have to have an internal commitment to the self-sacrifice, to the time required, to the just the patience required and the diligence and the care and attention required to teach children. That's for us to commit to, isn't it? That's for us to see the value of. And this is, oh boy, I mean, we have the ultimate example, don't we? Mums, your ultimate example is Jesus Christ, who gave up how much? How much did he sacrifice to teach other people? I mean, did those disciples frustrate him? Were they difficult to teach? Read the Gospels. Did he call them, what did he call them? Little children. It's funny, isn't it, that? And this is Mother's Day, and I want to give a shout out. And we should honor Christian mums who sacrifice themselves again and again and again to be able to pass on instruction to their children. And let me say to you mums, they're not going to thank you now. They may not even remember in years to come. Many of us, by the way, need to thank our mums. Did you thank your mum today? If not, you're going to go from here today and make a phone call, I hope. If you can, honor that sacrifice. But I want to say something to fathers too today. In verse 21, Solomon is instructing his son not to forsake and to keep in verse 22, to keep that teaching close to himself, to bind it around his heart and tie it around his neck. And fathers, men, mothers need and deserve our support. Right here, Solomon is lending his support to his wife's teaching to their son. And he is saying, son, don't forsake your mother's teaching. And men, our wives and the mothers in this fellowship deserve support, don't they? They don't need to be undermined and have dad come home and countermand everything that mum has just taught in the day. Change the rules. They don't need that. They need support and encouragement. Is it hard? The children need to know that the fathers see the value of the mother's instruction and are supportive in that. Also, men, there's an obvious need to enforce mother's teaching. The women often need that support, not leaving mothers to just do it all on their own. By the way, teaching is reinforced when somebody else teaches it, and Solomon was saying, keep your father's commandment and forsake not your mother's teaching. But in Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 1, he takes the same phrase, my son, do not forget my teaching, and the word is Torah. And obviously the mother wasn't doing it on her own. Solomon was involved, and she wasn't just the only one out there doing it. And men, we ought to take note. Do you think it's legitimate to say men ought to provide mothers with the time and the opportunity to devote themselves to teaching children. I think that's a legitimate thing to say, not just from here, but as you see the teaching of the Bible as a whole. And how's that going to affect your choices, man? The work that you engage in, the way you use your funds. In days gone by, people didn't have the same living standard. But mothers spent time with their children, and they taught their children infinitely more than is happening today. And the children didn't have iPads and computers and everything, but what they did have, would you say it's precious? Men, would you say it's worth giving up a certain amount of living standard to have your wife's involvement increase with your children? Inevitably, the woman, if she's at home, is going to be the one who does the bulk of the teaching for children. And we heard earlier from Chris about the impact that one woman's teaching from grandmother to mother to son had. And that son, oh boy, what did the Lord do with Timothy? Where did he go? How many people did he reach with the gospel? Who was blessed through Timothy's labors? So, word to singles. We're going to draw this to a close, but there's so many singles in the room. How does this apply to you? Well, I said it to begin with. We're in a body, we're in a church, and inevitably there are mothers in this church. I mean, spare a thought, please. Now, will you, for those worn out, frustrated, discouraged mums? And if you want to do something good, there's probably a mum somewhere who's desperate to have a little bit of time to talk to her little Johnny. But she's got this to do, and that to do, and the other to do, and you've got nothing to do. And, well, hey, can you iron? Can you clean? I heard one amen. I mean, sure there's more out there. What about the single mums? Can you imagine struggling every day to pay the bills and having to drop your child off at a nursery because there's no other choice for you at that point in your life? Can you imagine how that feels? And should we as a church be reaching out to and helping? And you single people with time on your hands, the wealthier people with money in their pockets. I mean, is there someone somewhere that needs your help? I mean, look around you. And I think you'll find plenty of opportunities to do good. I do believe we need to value mothers' teaching as both fathers and as a church. If it's ever going to retake the place that it deserves in society. Let's just think about this for a moment. Do we believe this, that when they walk, mother's teaching will lead them? Wherever they go, verse 22, they will have their mother's words in their ears. Do we believe that when they lie down, their mother's teaching will watch over them? Now, the context of this passage is that it goes on to speak about these instructions, keeping Solomon's son from the evil woman, from the one who's adulterous. And, oh boy, when that child lies down, maybe later in life, is mother's teaching going to watch over them? How many of you mums talk frankly to your sons about sexual immorality, about the immoral woman, about the woman with adultery on her lips? Could you tell them a thing or two about some women that they need to be careful of, or that mums would pick up? Sex education. I'm not saying the dads should shirk it, but that mums would pick up the teaching, the instruction of their children as well. In these areas, it would be so helpful, wouldn't it? Do you believe that when they wake one day, their mother's words are going to talk with them? What about if you've laid down the law? What about if your child has heard the gospel at your lips? And what about that day if one day they wake up and they hear their mother's words in their ears? With their own sinful heart laid out before them, they can hear the gospel that you taught them. At that moment, would it all be worth it? I would say that at that moment, there is no amount of self-sacrificing, patient instruction that you would ever regret. If only you knew that your words rang in their ears. Let's pray for mothers, shall we, at GraceLife London? Let's honor them. Oh Lord in heaven, we beg you to help our sisters who carry the load of patient instruction of children. So many times they carry it alone, and we beg you for that not to be the case in marriages in GraceLife London. But we ask you, Lord, to help them with their task, to help them to find you, and that you would enable them to patiently and carefully instruct the children and lovingly teach them what is right and what is wrong, but also skillful living, and enable them to teach the gospel, the whole Bible, the message that runs through and through, that you came to redeem your fallen creation and that you're coming again. Oh Lord, bless us with mums that teach, and bless the mums who do. Reward them for their sacrifice, Lord. Bless them for their labors. Help us as men to honor them, to support them, to provide for them, to do all that we can do to help them with their task. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.